Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
I'm standing at the Stadium Village station of Metro Transit's Central Corridor line, better known as the Green Line. The Green Line opened in June. It starts in downtown Minneapolis, winds its way through the University of Minnesota campus, through the Prospect Park area, down University Avenue in the Midway area of St. Paul, and finally ends in downtown St. Paul. This month on Access Minnesota, we talk about the state of mass transit here in the Twin Cities. We'll also look at the prospects for future growth, both here and in greater Minnesota. We'll talk with Laura Bannon, who is the communications manager of Metro Transit, on the development of the Central Corridor line. We'll also talk with University of Minnesota professor Yang Ling Fan about mass transit and the prospects for the future. Laura Bannon is communications manager for the Central Corridor LRT project, which operates as the Metro Transit Green Line. Laura, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me.
Laura, the Green Line opened just recently in June, and it connects Minneapolis and St. Paul. Tell us about how the Green Line was conceived and when did Metro Transit become involved in the project?
Well, there was talk of doing the Central Corridor light rail line back in the 1980s, but the work really got underway after Ramsey County finished the draft environmental impact statement at the end of 2006. That's when the Metropolitan Council took over the project to design it, build it, and eventually operate it.
Well, many of the areas that the Green Line runs through, for example, the University of Minnesota, the Midway area of St. Paul, the downtown areas, contain a lot of historic buildings and businesses and even some sensitive scientific experimental equipment at the University of Minnesota campus. Tell us about how you dealt with the neighborhoods and their specific concerns about the project.
Well, the Met Council, when they established the project office, hired outreach coordinators and then assigned them to neighborhoods, zones along the project. We very intentionally hired people who had either grown up in the community or had some sort of connection to it, maybe went to school there, and also spoke the numerous languages on the corridor. And then when we hired them, we said, you're not going to be sitting at your desk a lot. You're going to be wearing out your shoe leather. And they really did. So when they were assigned to territories on the line, they really got out there and got to know the businesses and the residents. We have over 1,000 small businesses up and down the line. And of course, there are 7 colleges and universities, as you mentioned, some with sensitive labs, recording studios. The line runs past a number of media outlets as well. So, we knew from the start that we'd be under a lot of scrutiny.
What sorts of concerns did you hear from the business and residential communities as the project was being developed and constructed?
Well, from very early on, first of all, everyone seemed to want the project. They really wanted the light rail line. There was a strong consensus for that, but a lot of concern about what life would be like during the construction process. It's a major public works project. We said from the start, it will be disruptive. There will be times when it's noisy. There will be dirt. That just happens with construction. But we did say that we would work hard to try to stage the construction in such a way to minimize the disruption. And that was also the reason we hired outreach staff to work with businesses to find a way to do this that would be at least disruptive and to help them be able to stay open.
How did Metro Transit incorporate community feedback into the final project?
Well, during the first years, when you're undergoing the design and the engineering process, we established some committees, a community advisory committee, a business advisory committee, and those groups met monthly with the engineering staff as well as outreach. And we asked at each meeting for feedback on various phases of the project to find out ways that we could make things least disruptive and also most beneficial. And some key changes were made to the design of the project through that process. For example, we heard loud and clear from the community that they wanted to have good pedestrian access to the stations and not have to walk all the way to a major intersection to cross the street. So Engineers added a number of pedestrian-only crossings to University Avenue. And you see that today when you drive up and down the corridor.
How does the Green Line help serve the Twin Cities area?
Well, you know, it restores a rail link between the two cities that we hadn't had for a good 60 years. The last streetcars on University Avenue ended service in 1953. The last streetcar anywhere in the Twin Cities ended in 1954. And of course, we had, you know, buses, but the buses that ran on University Avenue the last several years were extremely crowded. And at some point, you know, it's just a capacity issue. You cannot keep adding more and more cars to the road. The trains hold many more people than a single bus can. So there's a lot of job centers along this corridor that this will serve in getting people from home to work to school. There are 7 colleges and universities. I imagine this fall when schools resume and students come back, we're going to see how well it's going to be used. Students can get to internships and to jobs. They don't have to live right on the corridor. You know, they can connect with buses and live farther out, maybe where the rent might be cheaper, and come in or choose to live on campus. We'll see faculty and staff using it, visitors to the universities coming in. Flying in from out of town can take the Blue Line from the airport to get around. And, you know, we'll see a lot of in-between trips too. For example, in the state capitol area, people can get out easily now to lunch up and down University Avenue or go to downtown St. Paul and vice versa. So we're going to see a lot of in-between trips. And it's not going to be just commuters only morning and evening rush hours, but throughout the day as well.
How did Metro Transit involve artists in the design of the LRT stations?
Well, early on, we hired artists and we used these community advisory groups that we had established to help us hire them as well. We looked for artists who had experience in working on public art projects in terms of how well they could incorporate suggestions and feedback from the public to make the station art relevant to a community.
Well, now that the Green Line is open, you are on to your next project, the Southwest LRT. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. The Southwest LRT will be the Green Line extension. So the Green Line western terminus is, of course, at Target Field Station. And from there, one day you'll be able to ride a train without changing trains or seats out to Eden Prairie, or from Eden Prairie back all the way through Target Field to the U of M, State Capitol, downtown St. Paul. You don't switch trains there. So that's one misconception some people have had early on. It's one system. It'll be one continuous line. And we're in the project development phase yet.
Laura Bannon is the Communications Director for the Central Corridor Light Rail Transit Project, better known as the Green Line, operated by Metro Transit. Laura, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me.
Light rail lines carry big price tags, but is the investment actually worth it? Coming up next, a conversation with University of Minnesota professor Yang Ling Fan about mass transit and the costs and benefits associated with it.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
How people feel about mass transit has a lot to do with their age and where in Minnesota they live. With more on that, University of Minnesota professor Yang Ling Fan. Yang Ling Fan is a McKnight Land-Grant Professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Professor, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me.
The Central Corridor Light Rail Transit line in Minneapolis-St. Paul just opened in June. It connects the downtowns of Minneapolis and St. Paul, passes through the University of Minnesota area, through the St. Paul Midway area. Based upon the research you've done on mass transit, how do you see this line affecting the Twin Cities area?
Well, the impact of the Green Line will be multidimensional. We've done several research projects on the Blue Line, the Hiawatha corridor, which connects downtown Minneapolis to Mall of America and airport area. And so, based upon our research on the Blue Line, I can talk a little bit about the anticipated impacts of the Green Line. So, the Blue Line, we find out that they have a significant job accessibility impact on the region. So to give you an example, when we talk about job accessibility, we are looking at the total number of jobs that an average individual could access in the region. So the Blue Line, when we measured the impact, we looked at the 2002 data and the 2006 data. The Blue Line was opened in 2004, so it was a before-after comparison. And what we find out is that the Blue Line increased the job accessibility in the station areas by 30%. That's a significant increase. In addition, the Blue Line not only increased the job accessibility in the immediate station area, but also increased job accessibility in locations where there are bus lines that are connecting Blue Line. Because the Metro Transit, our transit agency, did such a wonderful job integrating light rail lines into the existing bus network. So therefore, the impact is actually regional. So we looked at the connection areas of the Blue Line. We defined the connection area as areas that there are bus lines, and within 30 minutes of bus travel, you can access the light rail stations. And we find out that although the Blue Line is only 12-mile long line, but the connection areas of a Blue Line actually include about 22% of the whole Twin Cities metropolitan population. So that's a significant regional impact that the Blue Line has, impacting 22%, at least 22% of the population in the region. So I anticipate that the Green Line impact will be even more significant, because the Blue Line the Green Line will connect the Blue Line and offer significant job accessibility impact to the whole region. So job accessibility impact is just one dimension. There are other dimensions. For example, property value increase. We find that along the Hiawatha Line, the Blue Line, commercial property value increased about 25 to 35%. After the implementation of the Blue Line. We found less positive impacts on the residential property value, but still there is a positive impact on the residential property value. And the Blue Line is different from Green Line because Blue Line was the first light rail line in the region. So therefore, if we look at the Green Line, we can see that because the developers already anticipated the positive impact, so the development activities occurred along Green Line. Kind of like came a lot early than along the Blue Line.
When you look at the cost of mass transit, light rail in particular, and you look at the disruption during the building process of businesses, local communities, in the end, is that a short-term sacrifice for a longer-term gain, in your opinion?
Well, yes, in my opinion, yes. But also, I think it's in the public's opinions as well, because we actually did. Community survey along 4 transit corridors in the region, the Blue Line, the Green Line, the Red Line, which is bus rapid transit line, Cedar Avenue bus rapid transit line, and the North Star commuter rail. So we surveyed both residents and business owners along the 4 transit corridors. We asked them specifically what they perceive the how they perceive the short-term construction impact, and also, what are their long-term, their anticipation of the long-term impact of those transit corridors. We, from that from this particular study, we find out that yes, people have negative perceptions towards the short-term construction impact, but in the long term, if you look at both residential perception and the business owner perception, the absolute majority have a positive perception about the long-term impact of the transit corridors. So it's not only just my opinion; it's actually the data has shown that the majority of the residents and the business owners along the transit corridors, think that it's a positive thing for their neighborhood.
Professor Fan, talk a bit about the pros and cons of buses versus light rail transit. And in the end, is the more significant cost of light rail, is it justified?
Light rail obviously is more expensive than bus. But at the same time, the impact, especially the development impact that light rail stimulate is much higher than a bus stop or bus station could stimulate. People, when you build light rail lines, people see the significant investment that the government agencies are putting into their neighborhood. Bus stops doesn't carry that kind of visual impact. So if you look at the existing studies that look at the developmental impact of light rail line versus developmental impact of bus lines, they are not comparable. The amount of developmental activities that a light rail line could stimulate is far beyond what a bus station could stimulate.
Do you think public opinion toward mass transit is changing? In other words, do you see more people feeling that the investment made in public transit is worthwhile?
Yes, there is actually observed a generational shift in terms of lifestyles. There are the younger generation, they like the urban lifestyles, and they like the option of not being able to not use cars. So, essentially, we see a generational shift in terms of public opinions towards the transit. And in fact, it's not just public opinions. When we look at the most recent household travel survey data in the United States, we actually, for the first time in several decades, we see a decline in vehicle miles traveled. And increase in transit ridership. So that's very, I think that's a very significant change because for decades we have seen increase in vehicle miles traveled, and right now we actually see a reverse trend.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at the future of public transit with University of Minnesota professor Yang Ling Fan.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
And now more of our discussion about the future of mass transit with University of Minnesota professor Yang Ling Fan. Do people's opinions of mass transit depend upon where they live? For example, do you see differences in opinions between urban dwellers, suburban dwellers, and those in greater Minnesota?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, when we surveyed the residents and the business owners along the 4 transit corridors I mentioned earlier about this study, we actually found that because the Blue Line has a portion of it in suburban Bloomington area. And also, the North Star commuter rail serves both downtown Minneapolis, also that, suburban communities like Fridley, Big Lake, Queen Rapids, those suburban communities. When we compare the urban residents with the suburban residents, urban residents are much more positive about the impact that transit corridors that bring to their community, and suburban residents have more neutral opinions about what transit can do to their neighborhoods. In addition, we observe more racial differences in people's opinions towards transit in urban areas than in suburban areas, which is quite reasonable because we have more demographic diversity in urban areas, and the suburban areas, it's a much more homogeneous resident community.
We know that the trend of movement to the suburbs and greater ownership of automobiles contributed to the demise of the old streetcar system in the Twin Cities back in the mid-1950s. You have mentioned that younger people seem more disposed to living in urban areas. They also seem to be more willing perhaps to go without an automobile. Do you think those kind of trends bode well for the future of mass transit?
Yes, I think the generational shift really will build a momentum, for transit-oriented development. In fact, the developers in the Twin Cities already taking advantage of the generational shift in lifestyle. The fact that the younger generation embrace urban living. The significant development activity we're seeing in city of Minneapolis. The downtown area, both Minneapolis and St. Paul already indicate that, the developers already tap into, those opportunities. In fact, not only the developers recognize that, we also did, in a project, we interviewed business leaders in the region. And the business leaders are typically human resource directors, in established companies, well-established companies in the Twin Cities region. And the human resource directors told us that, they face a problem of aging workforce. In fact, one of them told us that, in the next 15 years, almost half of half of his company's workforce will retire. So they face a problem of attracting younger talent to the region, and they also see that there is a connection between transit and regional competitiveness because of the younger workforce, the younger generation that like the idea of urban living, like the idea of having a viable transit system, in areas where they live. So although that some of the businesses we interviewed actually currently at a suburban location, and the majority of their workforce currently use car to commute, but the business leaders actually see the importance of having a strong transit system in our region. I think because they have this important task of attracting younger talent and retain young talent in their companies.
We know at one point in history there were streetcars in Duluth. Right. There were streetcars in Winona and some other smaller cities in Minnesota. If these generational trends continue, do you see the desire for mass transit or improved mass transit filtering into other smaller cities, perhaps in Minnesota?
Yes, I think so. In fact, not only streetcars in those smaller cities, and I also can see that better connection by rail between the Twin Cities and those smaller cities. So I think it's also about not having to drive for 2 hours or 3 hours to get from Duluth to the Twin Cities. You can get on the train and surf on the internet, while during your trip, instead of behind the wheels and get stressed about the road traffic. So I think the positive impact of rail investment, goes beyond the economic dimension. Also, it's about quality of life. Travel time. You can make your travel time extremely pleasant if you use the transit.
Yang Ling Fan is a McKnight Land Grant Professor in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Professor Fan, Thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.